Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
It's a real thrill to introduce T. Ryan Gregory. I've been following his work on genomes and evolution for quite a few years now. And actually we agree on a few things, I think, which is quite exciting. T. Ryan Gregory is known more casually as Ryan Gregory. The T stands, no, you have to ask him what the T stands for. He was born in Aurelia, and as he's fond of pointing out, pre-casino Aurelia, and went to school at McMaster as an undergraduate, then did his Ph.D. at the University of Guelph, followed by two rather interesting postdoctoral stints, one at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and the other at the Natural History Museum in London, England. Following those, Guelph hired him back, and he's been a professor at Guelph for the last 4 years, and recently got tenure, which is a pretty big deal if you're a professor. So he's probably going to be around for quite a long time, and we'll have a chance to invite him back. Ryan.
Thank you very much. This is my first time here, so I hope this is something that's appropriate for your venue and of interest to your membership. Basically, what I'm going to try and talk about today are a couple of examples in which our depictions of evolutionary processes, patterns, mechanisms, and so on are very well known. Some of them are iconic and yet can have a really an adverse effect if they're misinterpreted, as they often are. So I'm going to talk about two major ones, and you'll certainly recognize them both when I bring them up. People like to give an outline of talks, so this covers the two topics I'm actually going to talk about tonight, and that's all I'm going to say about my outline. So the first thing I want to talk about is this, what is troubling to many people, I suppose, about evolution, or certainly is the way evolution is often interpreted, is relating to humans and, moreover, their link to non-human primates, and the way that is often interpreted and has been since Darwin published The Origin of Species. I notice on my poster that's hanging up there, you've got one of the icons I'm going to talk about tonight, although in reverse it looks like. So good for you. So what happens when Darwin publishes The Origin of Species, and more importantly when he publishes The Descent of Man in 1871? Well, even prior to The Descent of Man, people were immediately drawing this connection between humans and non-human primates, and doing what is often done, which is satirizing this. So political cartoonists of the day were fast at work drawing examples of their interpretation of the meaning of this link between humans and non-human primates. In one sense, they're doing it by showing, say, gorillas exhibiting human behaviors, which is done for humorous effect, but it's again to sort of get to this linkage between humans and primates that was perhaps making some people uncomfortable. Let's just deal with it with some humor. The other way you get this expressed is with Darwin's head fixed atop the body of a chimpanzee, and you can see examples of this. These were published subsequent to The Descent of Man. You have examples where this one's not actually Darwin as a chimp. It's probably difficult to see from your vantage point, but he's got a handkerchief that's forming the tail, so it's sort of a subtle take on that one. And this, of course, is not unique to the British press. You see it also in on the continent as well. When Darwin publishes The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872, again, this image is at the forefront of political commentary on the work that he's doing. So in this case, you can see he's saying, I try and read it from here then. So really, Mr. Darwin, say what you like about man, but I wish you would leave my emotions alone. So the notion that Darwin and his ideas were encroaching on all aspects of human biology, expressed here in this same form, Darwin as a chimpanzee. You get more examples again, and then you start to see something interesting, which is this diagram here. Again, it starts out with chimpanzees up in the top left, on your top left, And but now you've got basically this idea of a progression. So down at the very bottom is a British upper class sort of aristocrat. And then various comments about different levels of goodness, meaning chimpanzees and so on at the bottom. Then you've got sort of the peasant classes all the way up into the highest of the high, which is the British royalty. So Darwin publishes, one of the last books he worked on was a treatment of the role of earthworms in affecting landscapes and in being involved in soil processes. His argument, I think, was largely that small things accumulated over a long period of time can have huge effects. So you might say, why would you write a book about earthworms if you're Charles Darwin? His argument was you might observe one worm ingesting and expelling soil and think nothing of that, but he went to some pains to show that this was actually having a dramatic effect on the overall landscape, on nutrient cycling and so on and so forth. So he had a point in doing this, but he can't seem to get away from this link. So he publishes this book on worms, and again you get this cartoon from Punch magazine where it says man is but a worm, and now it's got the linkage between an earthworm all the way back up to Mr. Darwin. So this progressionist idea, now it goes back to worms because he wrote about worms. So he just can't escape this kind of depiction, basically. Now, we don't often see Darwin heads on chimpanzee bodies in cartoons anymore, but you do certainly see many examples of progressionist thinking, or this iconic progress from chimpanzee up to humans depicted as a summary of what evolution is. And in fact, this is a Google search. If you go on Google Images and type evolution, this is the first page that comes up under images for evolution. So I don't know what the percentage is there, but it's quite high, of images that basically go back to this kind of lineup. So we see it all the time, and it's starting to be used more and more, again, in cultural commentary and political satire and so on. In this case, you've got a chimpanzee, and then culminating in what is probably taken as regressive evolution, where you're hunched over again and using a computer too much. But the point is that everybody knows what this is meant to imply, which is that this is not as good as what's on the far right of this diagram. Otherwise, this joke makes no sense. And you can see this kind of thing over and over again. Comments on the role of modern technology in making us less evolved, for example. So here you've got television, or there you've got the next stage in human evolution with the Segway going off a cliff. And of course, appropriate probably for this audience would be the commentary on the debate about evolution itself. So this lineup, again, says here Earth is only 10,000 years old, placed in the middle of an evolutionary lineup. Again, the premise of this joke is that this is not as good as that. So if you put somebody in the middle, they're not as highly evolved as the thing on the right. Again, this iconic image showing up again and again. Now, it's also used in advertising, and that is actually, once again, operated on the assumption not just that people who read political comics or scientists will get it, but just about anyone will get it, that something on the left of one of these diagrams is not as good as something on the right. So you can sell baseball gloves or nutrition bars or whatever, basically all by showing this same kind of diagram. That's how ubiquitous this diagram is. Now, it has some more directly relevant kinds of implications in this, being that it's so commonly recognized as a symbol of evolution. This is a mural that was painted by a student in Dover, Pennsylvania, that was taken by someone and burned, and that basically began much of the controversy in that school district about the teaching of intelligent design and so on and so forth. So somebody painted this image. It was immediately recognized as being evolution, and was not well received by whoever it was, which sparked off the Dover trial, which, as you know, had international headlines and turned out well for us, but may not have. Some more silly examples of this. So this is a T-shirt that was designed, this is more recent, that was designed by a marching band in a high school, and their point was simply to use this icon in a sort of a fun way. So you can see that the individuals in this lineup are actually carrying brass instruments. I don't know if it's really meant to be a commentary on You know, some instruments are lower than others, but basically this was just their sort of whimsical design, which then sparked off another controversy and led to this T-shirt being banned by the school. So you could argue that things are getting a little bit out of hand, that there is certainly far too much attachment to that image. And what I plan to argue is that it's actually a horrible image to begin with, that we shouldn't want that associated with evolution. I'm not free of getting hit with this kind of thing. So in the alumnus magazine from University of Guelph, they did a little story about teachers' workshop that a colleague and I organized, and there it is. So you can't get around it no matter what. They also got Darwin, and I actually noticed you've got one of these things sitting over there on the on your mail slots. So here's your Darwin playset, and it's what does it say there? From fishman to genius in only 380 million years. So why is this one of the icons of evolution? Why is it that you search on Google and the first page full of images that you find is this depiction of a progressive lineup of chimpanzee or something chimp-like through to humans as the pinnacle? Why is that so common? And I think there are some good reasons why that is, good historical reasons that we can understand. And one is that prior to evolutionary thinking in general, there was a lot of a tendency to rank organisms, going all the way back to Aristotle's Great Chain of Being, for example. And just as another case here from the 1700s, ranking not just living things according to higher and lower, but non-living things too. So if you look in the translated version over there, you can see there's fire and water and rocks and so on as well, ranked lower than living things, which progress up the chain of being with humans at the top. Sometimes you'll have angels or God above humans, but generally speaking, humans are very close to the top. So this predates evolutionary thinking by a couple of millennia, but it persisted through the origin of evolutionary thinking. And it persisted into Darwinian evolutionary thinking as well, and I think in part because in Victorian England you're looking at an atmosphere of progressive thinking. It's the Industrial Revolution. Things are getting better and better, more efficient, more powerful. This fits in well with the notion of progress that was part of that culture as well. Now, World War I tended to change people's minds a little bit about the role of technology, but this was easily mapped onto our new understanding of relatedness among organisms. It's a holdover from pre-evolutionary times, easily adapted to a progressionist view of evolution when evolution came along. And you'll still see examples of this in the scientific literature, not necessarily super common in evolutionary biology literature, but in things like psychology, for example, you'll see subhuman primate, submammalian vertebrate, lower this, lower that. You can find it in popular culture. So, for example, this is a Trivial Pursuit question. What's the highest class of animals? Anyone want to guess what it is? Yeah, well, I think they're actually trying to be accurate with the word class, but basically they're saying mammals. So everyone's supposed to know that the highest class of animals is mammals. That's obvious. That's why it's a Trivial Pursuit question, right? And then you get some examples like this, which are just completely egregious, and I don't know why this even was put in here. So this is a paper from Phylogenetics, Lessons from Lower Organisms, What Worms, Flies, and Zebrafish Can Teach Us About Human Energy Metabolism. There's absolutely no use to putting that term in there. I can't really understand why they bothered. But I guess it still, the point is it still will pass peer review in a genetics journal in 2007 using the term lower. Okay, so they're, okay, right. So then it really doesn't add anything because it's obviously, they know it's not a real term. I see. What it does, though, is it assumes that everybody is going to know what lower implies, right? I mean, if they were not using it at all, it wouldn't be in the literature. Let me put it that way. And if I'd reviewed this paper, I would have said, why on earth would you make that statement in the title of a genetics paper? Anyway, the point is that you can still find examples of it. Quotation, let's say these guys are actually on a mission or not. Either way, it shouldn't show up in the peer-reviewed literature. You can go back to Darwin's original notes and see that he did not interpret evolution in these terms. So he's got an argument here that it's absurd to talk about one animal being higher than another, and that we generally ascribe traits that we possess as being higher. If you were to ask a bee or something, they would say, well, instinct or whatever is higher. So he was recognizing the notion of subjectivity in ranking things higher and lower. Okay, so what is the antidote to this higher, lower, progressionist, linear thinking about evolution that is depicted in that classic icon? I think the solution to that problem is an improved tendency towards tree thinking. In other words, thinking about things in terms of branching history, phylogenetic relatedness, as opposed to linear progressionist kind of processes. So again, Darwin was one of the first to kind of put this in an explicit sense, the tree of life. And so this is a classic quote from The Origin, where he says, "As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation, I believe, it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications." So The Origin has a lot of very wonderful prose in it, also a lot of inefficient prose, but this is one of the good paragraphs. And here's the metaphor of the tree of life showing up right in The Origin of Species. And it's been argued by some that not understanding evolutionary trees is basically equivalent to not being able to read maps if you're into geography, that they're fundamental to understanding how things are linked together, how things evolve over time, and that it's critical to have a good grasp of tree thinking, but unfortunately that is not common, that tree thinking is not actually common. And it's certainly been my experience that students have a difficult time understanding phylogenetic thinking, even in basic form. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that, some of the classic issues that confound people's understanding of phylogenetic trees. So everybody's probably familiar with this diagram. You actually had this notebook at the ROM when the Darwin exhibit toured through. This is from 1837, and it's his depiction, which is noted with this classic line, "I think," where he's drawn, instead of a linear kind of arrangement of species, or these are just arbitrary species designations, but he's arguing that what you've got here is a series of branchings, that things are related through a branching process of descent. So this is long before, this is more than 20 years before The Origin's published, but already he's thinking in terms of trees. And there's only one figure in The Origin of Species, and this is it. Again, it's a made-up phylogeny of non-existent species, but the point is he's trying to depict the notion of branching, descent, things are related through common ancestry, and that can be expressed in the form of a tree. So human beings, most of them are familiar with the notion of branching descent and common ancestry and how to interpret diagrams that depict this, but not so much in the form of evolutionary trees. They're used to thinking about this in family trees. So if you think about a pedigree, for example, and this is my family tree on my paternal side. So you've got my grandfather, my father, my brother, my uncles, and no one would have any problem understanding the kinds of relationships that are depicted here. So if I were to say, for example, what is Chad's relationship to me, I don't think anyone would have any problem pulling out that he's my cousin, right? Or, Pete versus us, why is he considered a grandfather? Because he's the father of both of our fathers, and so on. So people are very used to thinking about this kind of branching descent in terms of family trees, relatedness, and common ancestry. It doesn't confuse anyone when you're talking about family trees. You get into phylogenies, though, for some reason it falls apart. However, a phylogeny really is very similar in principle to a family tree. So you can actually try to think of them that way as I talk about some of these examples. So here's a basic abstract kind of phylogeny showing the major components of a tree. And again, you've got the common ancestor of everybody that's depicted on the tree. That's usually known as the root. So again, arboreal terminology here. As you might expect, the lines that go out from a common ancestor are called branches. And then you've got tips, or what are called terminal nodes, that often represent living species, but you can build phylogenies with genes or extinct things from the fossil record or what have you. And you also have internal nodes that represent more recent common ancestors shared among some of those terminal nodes. In one case here, DEF, you can see that there's what we call a polytomy, which basically means it's either not resolved or it actually was a period of rapid speciation where three things came off a common ancestor and we can't tell if there was any branching order within that. So if in the case that that's a real phenomenon, we would call that a hard polytomy. If it's just we haven't got the resolution, we'd call it a soft polytomy. What we're interested in a tree like this is simply the order of branching, and that's called the topology. So there are lots of different ways to present phylogenetic trees, which may contribute, I suppose, to some of the confusion surrounding how to interpret them, is that you see them in so many different formats. All of these trees show the same thing, and they show the order of branching, the order of common descent of species A through E, and they're just basically arranged or drawn in different ways. But they all show exactly the same relationships, and you're welcome to take a second and just see if that's true. So A is the outgroup, and then you've got, say, F and C branching together, D and E branching together, and so on and so forth. So these are all exactly the same tree in terms of topology. What we're interested in terms of using trees for taxonomic purposes, for example, is looking for groups that share a common ancestry and make sense from an evolutionary point of view. And the technical term for that would be looking for monophyletic groups, or clades. It's very easy to tell if you've got a proper clade or not. All you have to do is imagine cutting a branch, grab that, pick it up, everything in your hand is a clade. So if you cut it here and you pull mammals, mammals is a clade. If you cut it here and pull it out, you're going to get basically, well, what I'll say is reptiles, but you'll get reptiles and birds as a monophyletic clade. The problem comes when you leave out one of the descendants of the group, or you add one that's actually not part of that clade. This is a common kind of problem that you run into quite a bit in taxonomic work, and part of the reason is that much of the early taxonomy was done on the basis of similarity, but we know that there are lots of ways to get similar phenotypes. Convergent evolution is a good one. Also, you can have differences in the rates of change of phenotypes. So for example, if you look at a bird, it's quite different from what we classically call reptiles. But genetically speaking and phylogenetically, they're nested within reptiles. So in this case, if we were to cut here, we would have to cut again to leave birds out to have our traditional taxonomic grouping known as reptiles. So that's called a paraphyletic group, and that's a no-no if you're a cladist. And if you're trying to do systematic classification of organisms, you don't want that. You don't want to leave birds out. So in this definition, birds would have to be part of reptiles, or else the term reptiles needs to be in quotation marks to signify that it's not a real term. So this is relevant for questions like, are we descended from monkeys? And you'll hear that kind of question a lot. Now, I won't get it. I don't think I need to clarify the question of, if we're descended from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? We share a common ancestor with existing monkeys. We did not evolve from them, so on and so forth. That's a very easy one. This question is more difficult. Are we descended from monkeys or not? It depends how you use the term monkey. If you mean modern monkeys, ones you could see at the zoo, for example, the answer is no, absolutely not descended from those. We share a common ancestor quite a long way back with those species. However, if you look at this tree, you'll notice a couple of important things. One, that New World monkeys are actually the outgroup to all the other primates. Old World monkeys are more closely related to the other primates than they are to Old World monkeys. And what that means is that the term monkey is paraphyletic. It leaves out all the other primates. So, if you want to use that term in a cladistic sense, yes, we're descended from monkeys because we are monkeys. And likewise with apes. If you say, are we descended from apes? No, not any of the modern apes. Are we descended from apes? Yes, insofar as we still are apes. So it makes the question a little bit more complicated, but it can be answered once you understand those relationships. Okay, now one of the things that's really important to understand about phylogenies is that they are mobile, in the sense that every node can be rotated. Just like a baby's mobile that has a branch point here and a branch point here, and every one of those can rotate independently of the other, which I gather is why they're fun to watch. That can happen with phylogenies as well. Any one of these nodes can be rotated. So what you're looking at here, for example, is one version of this tree, and what I'll get you to do in your mind is just simply rotate a couple of nodes, and you'll notice that you get that tree. So go ahead and just take a second to do that. So you're going to take this node and you're going to flip it, and then you're going to take this one and flip all that stuff, and you'll get that tree. The point of this, and if I see some people squinting and struggling, that's kind of the issue, but it's important to recognize that this is the case. So if you can convince yourself that that's true, the topology of these two trees is not different. What that means is that the order of the branches along the tips means nothing, because I can change them by rotating any internal node without affecting the branching order. And I can convert that one back into this one by rotating 2 more nodes. And then this one I won't ask you to do because it's got multiple nodes that have to rotate. But all of these things are equivalent, exactly equivalent in the evolutionary relationships that they show. So the other issue here is that often you'll see evolutionary trees presented in what's called an unbalanced form or a ladderized form, meaning that you always put the more diverse set of species on one side and the less diverse on the other side. So for example, if you look at H, there's only one off on the right from that first branch point, but there's all the rest on this side. The next branch up, G is the only one, and then all the rest. So that's a ladderized tree. And that can have pretty significant implications for how people understand what a phylogeny is actually saying. So you'll often see, for example, that A might be human, or it's the mammal in the tree, or it's the vertebrate in the tree, implying that this means something, that this is heading somewhere, but it's completely meaningless because this non-ladderized version of that tree is exactly the same topology as the top one. Okay, so how can trees help us to understand better our place in nature? I've showed you a couple of the basics of phylogenies. I'll talk about some misconceptions in a minute, but can we think about trees in a way that will help us, on a very simple level, come to grips with our place in the animal kingdom, for example, and beyond the animal kingdom? And Larry, there's one thing you're not going to like on here, I think. All right, so people have thought about this for some time. Before Darwin published The Descent of Man, Huxley published Man's Place in Nature and talked about some of the similarities between humans and non-human primates. There's a classic drawing from that book that's actually depicted on the cover of this version here. These are just basically a lineup of living things to show similarities in skeletal structure, and they're all drawn to a similar scale so that you can see the similarities, but maybe this is one of the origins of that kind of lineup. I don't know. The point here, though, is that you don't have a linear process of evolution. If you look at a tree depicting fossil species of hominids, for example, what you'll see is that there are many cases, many times in the evolution of our own lineage, where multiple hominid species coexisted. That's not true now, but 40,000 years or so ago it would have been, because there would have been Neanderthals as well. But there are certain periods where there were probably 4 or 5 separate hominid species living at the same time, and in some cases in similar areas. And you can imagine what life would be like now if we had 4 or 5 hominid species, truly separate species of hominids living on the planet. It would be much more difficult to assign ourselves as the end point of some linear process if there were 5 branch points still left alive today. So even just noticing this kind of complexity in the history of our own branching tree can help us to better appreciate the diversity that did exist, and that it's kind of a fluke in a sense that we are the only surviving representative of that lineage, and therefore the only logical endpoint of that lineage. It's what Stephen Jay Gould called life's little joke, that only unsuccessful lineages can actually be depicted as a progressive linear evolutionary path with a main line. So this is actually a sketch by Darwin done in 1868 of primate phylogeny. It's difficult to read. I think Darwin scholars would agree he had kind of notoriously bad handwriting. But he took a crack at classifying based on best of his knowledge. Some of these primates had only recently been brought back to London for observation in zoos and so on, but he took his best shot at it and actually didn't do too bad. There's a few cases on here where he's created some poly and paraphyletic groups, but overall he hasn't done too bad as far as that goes. People have been thinking about human and primate phylogeny for some time, is the point. Now we have a much better understanding through genetic work, more detailed morphological work, and so on and so forth, to give us a good sense of where we sit within this tree. So one thing I'll point out, you'll notice humans are stuck at the far right. That's typical of trees. This is from a textbook, a first-year biology textbook. But you can see that we actually are the closest living relative of chimpanzees and vice versa. Neither of us is descended from the other. We're close cousins. They're not our grandparents. But we are closer to each other than either of us is to, say, gorillas or any of the other primates. Now, there are two species of chimpanzees. They're both equally closely related to us. If we put ourselves on the mammalian tree, this is a paper from 2007 showing a super tree that contains about 90% of mammalian species, which is about 5,000 species in total. And humans are right there. And you can get a sense now, if you start putting us on a tree that depicts all of the mammals, and mammals that's not a very diverse group as they come, you can already start to see the massive diversity in which we're nested. If we stick mammals on a tree of vertebrates, we can see that we just fit in with everyone else. If you looked at the diversity of vertebrates, certainly mammals are not on the high end. In fact, they're the lowest level of diversity. You've got things like teleost fishes that are about half of all vertebrate species. There's about twice as many birds as there are mammals. Vertebrates, or in this case the actual phylum Chordata, is one of, depending who you ask, 30 some odd phyla of animals. Animals fit within eukaryotes right here. The diversity of eukaryote lineages, the phylogenetic distances among some of these lineages is becoming better understood, but it's sort of consistently more than we thought. And it's becoming difficult to stay on top of the new classification system for eukaryotes. If you were in school a number of years ago, you probably learned 5 kingdoms. Before that, you might have learned animal, vegetable. Now, it's much more complicated than that, even just for eukaryotes. This is the one Larry won't like, which is some suggestion by certain authors based on genetic data that there are actually 3 domains or empires of life, of which eukaryotes is one, and the 2 classically named bacteria, single-celled things lacking nuclei, is divided into 2 deeply branching lineages, bacteria and archaea, and that the archaea is actually more closely related to eukaryotes than either is to true bacteria. So this is something of a point of contention. This is a very strong point of contention, whether there is a single identifiable common ancestor to everyone, or whether the exchange of genes was so rampant at that time you couldn't really pull out one individual species. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so that's what trees are. That's what trees can do for us in a very simple sense of putting us in perspective, not unlike the Hubble Space Telescope puts us in visual sense in perspective as to where we sit in the galaxy relative to 100 billion other galaxies in the known universe. If you look at the deep field photograph, for example, and see all those specks of light and think that each one of those is a galaxy, it puts you in perspective quite strongly. I think that the trees, looking at our position within the diversity of life, can do something very similar. There's almost 2 million species described. Somewhere between 10 and 100 million species actually exist now. That's about 1% or so of things that have lived, and we're one of those. So I think it does put us in that perspective. But again, as good as trees can be for those kinds of purposes, you do find that they're commonly misunderstood. So I'm just going to run through a few examples of the most common misconceptions about evolutionary trees that you see. And I certainly see them even up to my 3rd-year evolution course at the University of Guelph. So it's very common. Okay, so this is actually from a paper that was published in Science a couple of years ago. And the question that the authors asked was, looking at a tree like this, which is most closely related to the fish? Frog? Who votes frog? Okay. Well, the answer, okay, so if I show this tree, which is most closely related to the fish? Go ahead at the back, yeah? All of them, that's right. We're all equally closely related to the fish. These 2 things show the exact same topology. And again, you can't read across the tips because you can rotate those internal nodes. So the most recent common ancestor outside of the fish is shared by everybody else. Therefore, everyone else is equally closely related to the fish through that common ancestor. It's like asking, who's more closely related to, a great uncle, me or my cousin? Well, they're equally closely related to that relative because we share this ancestor here. So that's a very common misconception. So common, in fact, that that's what they put into the journal Science a couple of years ago, knowing that people would get that. This is related to an issue. If you look at this tree, it's very easy to interpret this as suggesting that this fish is primitive or is the ancestor or very similar to the ancestor. Often you'll find that this lineage here, which is technically called the outgroup, is often depicted or described as the basal lineage. Basal meaning the lower lineage or the earliest branching lineage. So again, within the last few years, it's been necessary to publish, for some people, to publish papers in peer-reviewed journals that clarify for biologists some of these common misconceptions. So a really good example is Crisp and Cook's paper from 2005, simply asking, do early branching lineages signify ancestral traits? And they go through a gamut of examples where people have interpreted data in a certain way based on the assumption that farthest branching lineage is like the ancestor, or the basal equals primitive. So if I just show you this tree in the abstract and say, this is the lineage that would be described as basal, right? It's the first one that branches off from the rest, and it's the longest branch is another point there that you usually see. Often it's arranged so that it's on one of the extreme sides, so on and so forth. So if I showed you just this tree, I'm not going to put anything on it just yet, you can probably guess which one is called basal and which one is usually assumed to be the most primitive, right? I mean, does everybody agree that you would assume that this one is the most primitive? Well, this is actually an accurate tree showing humans as the outgroup to echinoderms. Nobody in their right mind would argue that this ancestor shared by the chordates and the echinoderms looked like a human. In other words, this lineage, basal if you like to call it that, is not primitive, does not look like the common ancestor. And it's very easy to see it when you show a group like this where we say, well, these echinoderms, obviously their ancestor didn't look anything like a human. That's very obvious to us. When you start getting into groups where it's less obvious, say you've got a tree of fruit flies, and you start talking about the basal lineage of flies, people get confused and make this mistake. And it's no worse when you do it with flies than when you do it with humans and echinoderms. So I like to use this with my students and sometimes in talks to biologists as well. Early branching is not the same as ancestral. You also find examples where people talk about the main line in evolution. Again, this is hearkening back to a linear thinking about evolution. But you will also find it in modern times used within the context of talking about a phylogeny. I'll give you an example in a second. But here's a good example of that from T.H. Huxley, where he says the teleost fishes appear to be off the main line of evolution to represent sidetracks starting from certain points of that line. Now again, half of all vertebrates are teleost fishes, so it's a huge side branch, if anything. So what do we mean by off the main line? Again, this I think is where you get into trouble looking at ladderized, unbalanced trees with humans or whatever on one of the extremes. So in this case, the main line, if you were going to interpret it that way, is the lineage from the root here to humans, and all these are sidetracks off that line. That's the interpretation. That's the kind of thing Huxley is getting at. It's very common to see that interpreted that way as well. So I can adjust this tree a little bit. This is also accurate. So I've got tetrapods here, and I've got perch at the far end, and they're all more closely related than they are to the cartilaginous fishes. So the main line now leads to perch, and tetrapods are an offshoot of that main line. That interpretation strikes everyone as silly. The other one is very common. But phylogenetically speaking, they're equally silly. Okay, the other thing is that this idea about unbalanced trees, often what you'll see is an interpretation that because there's one really long branch here, that it's assumed that nothing has happened along that branch, that no evolution has really taken place. And that's the root, really, of this linkage between outgroup and primitive. The idea that this is the same as this implies that there hasn't been very much change along that lineage. Now, if I plot this with humans as the outgroup to amphibians, you again would not assume that that common ancestor was like a human. And if I put more detail on this side of the tree, you'll see, of course, there's lots and lots of branching going on there. It just wasn't depicted. Very easy to see when you plot humans and amphibians, not so easy to see when you plot cartilaginous fishes and other vertebrates. Easy to misinterpret when you aren't thinking properly about trees. Another one is, and I run into this in terms of genome evolution, didn't such and such a group just have longer to evolve bigger genomes? Okay, the problem with that is that because things are descended from common ancestors, every lineage that you're talking about from a living thing compared to another, those lineages, not necessarily those recognizable groups or that species, but those lineages are of exactly the same age down to the nanosecond because they go through a common ancestor. So if I say, fishes recognizable in the fossil record appeared before mammals did, that's not an inaccurate statement. If I say the lineage now represented by these fishes has had more time to evolve whatever than humans have, the human lineage has, that's false because we share a common ancestor down here, and that branch point in terms of time is exactly equal on both sides. It has to be. Otherwise, you're undermining the notion of common ancestry. Okay? So this was the paper that was published in Science, and I mentioned it was a few years ago, so 2005. And I think it's kind of telling that Science decided this was important enough a problem to publish in that journal. If you know the rejection rate of Science, it's extremely high. So to get a paper in there basically saying, hey, which is closer to a frog, suggests that the editors of Science think there's a real issue here. Nature also in the same year published a perspective piece talking about our tendency to look at evolutionary trees incorrectly, to still rank them in terms of this scala naturae or great chain of being, and misinterpreting the biology on that basis. And it's great that these two journals, well, it's tragic in a way that these two journals felt it necessary to do this. It's great that they did. I just wish they'd followed their own advice, in the sense that when the platypus genome was published, both journals screwed up the phylogeny fairly significantly. So this one's tough to make out, but this one isn't. So if you look, for example, right below where it says Science there, just see if you noticed anything funky about that phylogeny. Right in here. All right, I'll read them for you. It says eutherians and marsupials, so your placental mammals, marsupials, and monotremes, which is your duck-billed platypus and echidnas, crocodilians and birds, snakes and lizards. Anybody? So who are crocodilians and birds most closely related to, us or snakes and lizards? Yeah, that's not what that tree says. And that was published in Science, and Nature did the same thing. They put lizards and snakes as an outgroup and stuck crocodilians and birds in with us. And I don't know if that's because they get confused about the bill. You certainly saw a horrible number of quotes in the popular press, some of them by scientists, talking about how duck-billed platypus was a mixture of avian and mammalian traits, which is a horrible interpretation. They do not have any avian traits. So, rather, they are a mixture of primitive and derived or different characters. So, yes, they have a bill and they lay eggs and so on, but they also have electroreception and venom and various things that no other mammals have. So they're very derived as well. So even when we start talking about trees, there's this tendency to do certain things with them, to emphasize one lineage that's of interest, to put humans in a privileged position on the tree. And this goes all the way back to, for example, Haeckel in the 1870s drawing this is a famous tree called the Pedigree of Man. And you'll notice that man is in the center, the very top, and everything else is essentially drawn as an offshoot, a minor offshoot of that main line in the tree. And as I mentioned, you've got this issue where you often have humans stuck at one of the extreme ends, the top usually, or the right. And I don't think intentionally implying, but certainly subconsciously implying to many people that there's something about that order of lineages. But again, you could rotate any one of those internal nodes that you like and have humans here and the lemurs on the far end and so on and so forth. Okay, so the other issue that's going on right now with thinking about trees, I've argued that they're important, and they're important not just for scientific purposes in terms of analysis and evolution. They're very important for allowing us to correct many misconceptions about evolution if they themselves are interpreted correctly. There's also debate, though, within the scientific community as to where trees stand as a scientific concept. So this is one version where you've got a paper from last year in the journal Genome Research that is basically perfectly fine with trees and throws it on their cover, and there are a number of examples like this with trees depicted on the cover of scientific journals. So very good. Then you have those who are arguing that gene exchange among major lineages is actually much more common than people assumed, which undermines the notion of a tree with permanent branch points that remain separate forever. So instead you've got more like a web of life, or some people have called it the mangrove of life, where you've got intercrossing of lineages at certain branch points in history. So for example, our own mitochondria being derived from a bacterial lineage is an example of that. They also argue, in the more extreme case, that bacteria generally, and certainly early on in evolution, exchange genes so rapidly that you can barely identify a coherent lineage or species of bacteria. And that's where you get into the trouble interpreting the last recent common ancestor. If everything was sharing genes rampantly, there's not necessarily one identifiable ancestor that you could pinpoint. Then you get this extreme version of interpreting this debate. So this was on the cover of New Scientist not long ago. Obviously raised a stink. Anybody who's followed Sandwalk or other blogs out there knows this made some people upset. Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. If you read the actual article, it's not so bad. They're talking about this controversy more or less that I just mentioned. But the creationists, as an example, don't read the article. They hold this up. And in fact, this was held up in Texas as part of the hearings on the high school biology textbooks. So I think this is basically irresponsible, and it's not an accurate interpretation of the debate. Trees work fine for vertebrates, for example. They probably work fine for animals. They probably work fine for most eukaryotes. They may work fine for everything except for early on and a few crazy exceptions. It's not true that the tree metaphor is dead and useless. So it's also worthwhile pointing out that Darwin himself wasn't completely sold on the notion of a single tree with a single root. So he says here, I believe this metaphor largely speaks the truth. He says all the members of the same class. So that would be, for example, mammals, or if you wanted to be more generous, then say all vertebrates. He didn't say everything. And then he says that I believe the animals have descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors. So he didn't even say animals had a single common ancestor necessarily. So he wasn't being overly dogmatic about that point. And so on and so forth. So basically, the tree of life metaphor was meant to be just that, a metaphor that's useful in guiding our thinking. It's not so incorrect, though, that we need to chop it down or to proclaim on the cover of a science magazine that Darwin was wrong. Darwin wasn't wrong. He said this. And even if he were, who cares? I mean, he wrote this 150 years ago. Okay, so now what I will do in sort of closing here is talk about, I think trees are important. I think they're very useful. I think people have trouble with them. I think they can help us to correct some of the other misconceptions, the visual distortions of evolutionary history. But it's hard for people to get an intuitive understanding of how trees work. But that may change in the sense that new technologies, new freely available resources, new interactive exercises are making it more likely that people can get in there and feel like they have a connection with trees and get a better grasp of how they work. So I like this quote quite a bit, which is that Google Earth changed the way people look at geography. If you want to go there and look anywhere on the world, zoom right down in, sometimes to the street level, and see a drug deal somewhere, captured by Google's cameras, you can do that. You can rotate around, get a sense of scale, get a sense of distance. You can do all kinds of interesting things with the world geographically you couldn't do a while ago. And it's been argued that some things are going to allow something similar with trees. So this is one example. It depends if you like molecular clocks or not, but you can go on this site and type in any 2 species that have been sequenced. It will run a calculation for you and tell you how long it's been since your last common ancestor. So if you want to know how long has it been since the lineage that's currently represented by mice and the lineage that's currently represented by humans, how long ago those split from a common ancestor, you type in human and mouse, and it will run an algorithm based on genome sequence data, and it will spit out a number. In this case, I think it's 90 million years or something like that. So you can do that with dog, you can do it with yeast if you want to know, and so on and so forth. So the point is that no matter what you put in there, if there are data, it will give you a time, which means that there was a common ancestor for that thing. Okay. There's another one. This is the interactive tree of life, and you can scroll across these species. These are ones that have been sequenced, their genomes. You can scroll across and get a little bit more information about the species in question. You get a picture of it, for example. We're now looking at some vertebrates, and there's mouse, so it's things that have been studied pretty heavily. There's rat, and human, of course, is in there. And this is the actual picture that's on this website depicting our species, if you use this. This is another one that you can go on that's put out by the Wellcome Trust that allows you to pick two branch points and look at the lineage that has led to those two, talk about the genetic distance between them or the time distance between them and so on. It's more interactive. You can rotate them around. This is more like the Google Earth than the other ones, certainly. And then this is actually Google Earth. And so what this one will do is you can go on there and you can lay over a geographical map of the world, a phylogeny. So now you can incorporate a geographical dimension into where those samples were collected, for example, when you build the phylogeny. So you're looking at here, it's probably difficult to see with those lights, but basically you're looking at a tree showing versions of a virus derived from different sources and where they were sampled and how those different populations that were sampled are related to each other. So if you want to track, for example, an outbreak, and this is looking at it in different units of time, if you want to look at where did an outbreak originate, where did it go next, when did it branch off, when did it affect a different group of hosts, you can see that with a time dimension, a geographical dimension, and a phylogeny all put together actually within Google Earth. Google Earth now supports this kind of application. So the ability to go in there and use trees in a different way to really get a physical sense of what's going on there, I think that's getting better and better with technology right now. So with that, I am happy to take any questions you may have about this topic. Thank you. It's not about chimps, is it, Larry?
No, but I can't believe you didn't show the dog-ass plot. You must have it, right? Do you have it? Can you explain what's wrong with it?
I can probably find it. I don't know if I can describe it. It's actually a classic
let me fill the rest
case.
of you in.
Yeah,
As a blogger, he gets into a fair number of interesting discussions, and he's created a term called the dog-ass plot, which I suppose we'll miss the significance if you don't have it.
You go ahead and describe it. I'll see if I can locate it.
But essentially, it's a way of depicting data that's false. You can align almost any sets of data to show a progression when it doesn't actually exist. And if the progression, if the data resembles what you expect, then you tend to believe it. In his case, it's genome size. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and guess who's at the top? Humans. And so you automatically acquire this false image of progression and whatnot. And it just turns out that it wasn't humans, it was mammals. And it was a dog sitting on the top of the thing. I forget what was sniffing then, but it was in a scientific journal, and so
yeah,
it sort of reinforces your point.
I'll see if I can dig it out.
I thought you might.
Meanwhile, but so the point was an argument about the role of non-coding DNA in development, and that the more of it you have, the more complex you can be, is the argument, which is doesn't really fit the pattern that we know. And yet, in order to make this point, they had a bar graph showing amount of non-coding DNA versus an unlabeled axis, which was basically yeast and then whatever, and a kind of germ and something, and then a dog. And the dog was actually sitting such that its rear end was directly over where the mammal data would actually be if you had included all of vertebrates, because lungfishes might have 40 or 50 times more DNA than humans do. So my point was that if you looked at where the data actually are, it'd be right below the dog's ass. So I called it a dog's ass plot. And basically any figure where you're arranging the data in such a way that it supports your conclusion, especially if you have an unlabeled axis and sort of all based on assumed interpretations of your readers, then I called those dog's ass plots, or DAPs to be more polite. I'll see if I can find it afterwards.
In speaking to a group like this, you're speaking to people that are convinced about the validity of evolution. But we know that there are creationists that are biologists. Some accept evolution and some flatly deny it. How do they rationalize the various species and well, I'm asking you.
Well, it certainly depends quite a bit on your flavor of creationism. So if you're a young Earth creationist, you're going to assume that everything is within the last 6,000 years, created as is, more or less unchanging. If you're the intelligent design crowd will often talk about the orchard of life. So basically, you've got an origin here, and then maybe some change, but then another one, you know, not connected to that one, so that you've got basically separate trees for each kind of thing. And so as to what the biology is to explain that, I don't know, because it's not really developed in a proper biological sense. But they aren't shying away from the notion of trees. They just think that every lineage is a separate tree, not connected through a common root. So that differs fundamentally from what we're saying, which is that everything is connected through branching roots, right?
So I guess they're basically dualists. They accept the physical when it comes to biology, but when it comes to the mind, they.
I think that you'd find people drawing the point of duality at different steps. So, for example, you might get somebody who is 95% fine with evolution, but the soul is unique to humans, for example. So there's your branch point there. You might get someone else who says that intelligence is, you know, where it matters, and so on and so forth. So people can define that break point. The point, I think, is that somebody like that, a dualist, is assuming that there's a break. Not everything is connected in one way or another. There's something that's different here that does not exist here and cannot be connected. And so that's a different take on things versus your modern evolutionary biology, which is that there are connections between things.
Have you ever had this presented this program to a group of creationists?
I'm not. No, I haven't been invited. So
it would be interesting the reception.
Yeah, I think it depends on what they have a problem with. So if they have a problem with the notion of common ancestry, period, then yes, you're likely to find a lot of objection here. If they're more along the lines of sort of a deistic view where things got set off in the beginning by some designer, then all of this could be true and there's no problem with that. So there's quite a continuum of how extreme those views are and how much they accept or reject of this scenario. This is something I'm not so concerned. I mean, you mentioned this is an audience that accepts evolution. That's why I think it's more important to get it right on our end of the things, to understand these kinds of misinterpretations of evolution, and to not do them ourselves. Because when we're trying to get more people to understand it or accept it as science, it's important they not misunderstand it. I mean, it's harder to accept something if it doesn't make sense to you, and most of those interpretations don't make sense. So a creationist audience, I think you'd have to go to a different level in terms of the fundamentals of biology before you could even get to whether they're confusing what a tree is. I mean, the notion of an ancient Earth, for example, or evidence from genetics, or any of those things. See, the fact that I don't have to do that here is why I can talk about these sort of nitpicky things.
Have you made such a presentation like you did here in the United States, and what sort of response did you get? Is it sort of similar here, whether you're talking here or Europe? Are there differences, is what I'm asking?
Yes. Not so much. I don't think I've given this particular talk in the States. I've certainly spoken at conferences in the States, but usually that would be an evolutionary biology or molecular biology meeting. I do know that if you look at data on national surveys or surveys of students or whatever, the U.S. is an anomaly among Western nations, that they are very far down in the level of acceptance relative to Europe, and we're somewhere in the middle of that. It also varies by geography, not just by states, for example, but here there's a big split, rural versus urban. So you can find similar levels of acceptance or non-acceptance in Canada as you can in parts of the States. It's just those are not nearly as common, I think.
Yeah. If you have you lectured at all in universities in the U.S., and How do they sort of...
I gave a talk in Texas. It wasn't. It was more about genome size. But of course, all of that has evolution throughout it because that's the way you interpret those data. It's fine. I mean, and often I've had people in some of my courses that don't accept the premise of some of this. And what I say at the beginning of my class is that it's not my business to change your philosophy.
Yeah.
You're here to learn what scientists say and why, and you have to understand that. But what you do with it is your business. I mean, you could take a course in Roman mythology and not be a believer in Roman gods, but you do need to understand what they said and why they said it and so on. So I think I just leave it at that, and I present the evidence, I present the information, and I usually don't have any real problems.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Your point is that tree thinking is actually much more difficult than most people realize.
And I hope that's been conveyed adequately.
And that many people come with preconceived notions that are hard to disabuse, and it's a tough case. I'm just wondering what kind of success you have with your students. Do you think it works?
I think it works to an extent. I think the key is to make them become aware that they're misinterpreting trees. And so things like this, and this is the approach that these authors have taken as well, which is to ask that question on the assumption that most people will get it wrong. And then wonder, okay, why am I wrong? And try to learn the correct interpretation. And so I do stuff like that as well. There are other things you can do. I'll just have quizzes, and sometimes I'll have 4 trees and say, which one of these is not the same topology? And so they have to sit there and rotate in their minds. And I know you get the sort of same challenging look on their face when they do it. But if you force them to think about that, I think, and force them to do it and to interpret different trees, I think you can start to move them along that path. So that when they see something in the literature, for example, humans way out here, and they see some interpretation that implies that they're reading across the tips, it should irritate them. They may not be experts, but it should make them go, oh, that's not right. And that's as far as I think I can get in one semester with basically 1 lecture on phylogenies. But that's a pretty good start, I think. The key is exactly what you started your question with, which is that people, it's deceptively simple, as many topics in evolution are. Natural selection is another very good example where it's so simple in principle and really easy to get wrong. If you walk in thinking you get it, anything I say in class, you're just going to fold into your existing preconceptions. You have to challenge and say you don't get it, but you can if you do this and this and this. Some will, some won't.
So let's end with a much more profound question then. Why aren't you having the same kind of moderate success with your scientific colleagues who are supposed to be evolutionary biologists who still publish incorrect? So
one of the issues is that it's a mixed blessing in the sense that evolutionary thinking is becoming important for many different fields. And so many of my colleagues are genome biologists who are trained, often they'll come up through medical genetics, for example, or molecular biology, without any training in evolution, have never taken an evolutionary biology course. We did a survey of the graduate students on campus at Guelph from several colleges to try and get at some of this, whether they, how they interpreted evolution and so on. And a fairly large chunk of people who were in life sciences had not taken an evolutionary biology course, or not within the last 5 years. And so I suspect that a lot of people who are interested in evolution, who recognize the importance of it and therefore talk about it, have no training in it. So you end up with these intuitive interpretations that are not correct. It takes training to be able to read a tree. It's simple as that.
People think that it's simple.
They think it's simple, but it isn't.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. I think that's it for questions. Do you have one more
Oh.
question? Yeah, sure. Okay,
Yeah, that's fine.
About the terms you used, superior, actually higher and lower.
Yes.
Can't we use those terms when comparing living things that are present on Earth now with the ones that have become extinct?
No. I think there's a good quote from Dawkins who says, I recommend that evolutionary writers under no circumstance use the term higher and lower. And I think higher implies too many different things. It implies for example, better at something, more complicated, more intelligent, more human-like, all these things that are wrapped up together that aren't necessarily always correlated. You can say primitive and derived. Those are actual biological terms. So primitive simply means like an ancestor or like the ancestral condition, and derived means different from that ancestral condition. But primitive and derived, those terms refer to traits, not to species. So for example, if I say, is a duck-billed platypus primitive or derived? Your intuitive notion is to say primitive because it lays eggs, right? But I'd say, okay, it also can sense electrical currents and it has venom, which no other mammals have. So those are derived traits. And every species is a mixture of primitive and derived traits. If you look, for example, at humans and say, is 5 fingers primitive or derived? 5 digits is primitive. A bird with its 1 forearm modified for a wing is derived from the ancestral terrestrial vertebrate condition of 5 digits. So every species is a mixture of primitive and derived traits. So if you say, for example, are dinosaurs lower than, modern mammals, in what regard? So if you say in terms of how long they were dominant or how big they got or whatever, then the answer would perhaps be no. If you say in terms of how high their metabolic rate was, maybe the answer is yes. It depends on what you're talking about.
But an animal may be extinct now and be more complex than, say, a bacteria.
Well, bacteria are still the dominant life form on the planet. I mean, by far.
But they are primitive, and
they are primitive.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that they're okay.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
You can come back in 2,000 years and see who's still around, perhaps, or come back in 10 million. They've been here for almost 4 billion years. They're doing all right.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a very simple question. Is there any website you would recommend?
For this kind of
for
material?
this sort of topic that we...
So there's a couple. One of them is a website called Evolver Zone, just evolverzone.com, that I put together that has videos and other kinds of links to resources about evolution. There's a website that Berkeley has produced called Understanding Evolution, and I've actually got a paper in it's not free anymore. It was free. If you email me, I'll send you a copy. Called Understanding Evolutionary Trees, in the journal called Evolution, Education, and Outreach. And so it basically has a lot of the same diagrams. Actually, I lifted them from my paper for this talk. So that stuff is in there. It talks about, I think, 10 common misconceptions about trees or something. And there's a more recent one that I have out on natural selection. Same thing, the major misconceptions.
I noticed one of the ones you had is www.timetrees.org.
Yep.
Seems like a good one.
It's interesting. It's the one that Blair Hedges and Sudhir Kumar put out. Basically, it's linked to a book they've published that talks about, based on molecular data purely, when different branch points happened. So how long ago you shared a common ancestor with X. So if you want that, that's good. I think all of those should be linked on Evolver Zone. So if you went on there and just typed phylogeny, you'd find all these links, I think. Like the one from the Wellcome Trust, the Google stuff, I think should all be on there.
On evolution generally, just Google evolution, I guess.
If you type Understanding Evolution, you'll find a pretty good website that Berkeley has produced. It's aimed at senior high school, junior undergraduate kind of level, but it definitely talks about misconceptions and so on. It's a good start anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Gregory.
You're welcome.
For coming out, and thank all of you for coming out as well. It's great to have you. So don't forget to sign up on the mailing list on the way out, and I hope to see you at more upcoming C5 events. Thank you.
Anybody know what this is? 10 points. 10 points if you can guess what that is. Starfish, good guess.
That's God's example of evolution.
Perhaps. It's a bacterial colony. And it's the art done by a colleague in Israel who basically stresses them and causes them to branch out this way, and then he photographs them. And so it'll plug one other website while I'm mentioning it, microbialart.com, which is all different examples of people using living things to make art, including some from my lab, actually. So check it out. It's some cool stuff like that. Thanks.
Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
This event was hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, an educational charity promoting science, reason, secularism, and free inquiry. CFI Canada coordinates branches and campus groups across the country, runs a public education series, provides secular community services, incorporates cutting-edge multimedia such as blogs, podcasts, and YouTube, and is a regular voice in the press presenting a secular humanist, atheist, and skeptical perspective. Visit us at www.cficanada.ca and contact us at info@cficanada.ca.